Welcome to the Sandwich Speaker Series, How to Plan for the Future, Creating a Legacy of Love with Christy Byrne Yates. My pleasure to introduce Christy. Christy is a proud member of the sandwich generation, and she certainly felt the struggle while raising two children and working full-time in education. She experienced the extreme highs and lows of this period. After both of her parents passed away in 2015, she took time to write about the many challenges that families and caregivers face in her book, Building a Legacy of Love, Thriving in the Sandwich Generation. She's an expert in supporting caregiving families and incorporates mindfulness along with other evidence-based practices to support growth, goal achievement, and a pathway to overall wellness for the whole family. In California, Christy is a licensed educational psychologist, author, speaker, and coach, and we're delighted to have her with us today. Welcome, Christy.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here. Thanks, Simone.
You're welcome. I will be tech support and monitoring the chat for questions, but for now, I'm going to turn off my camera.
Oh, great. Thank you. Well, I'm delighted to be here, and Simone and I have talked. There are going to be some times where I'm going to ask her to maybe stop the recording so that we don't have any personal information, so I can ask you something and you can throw some things up in the chat, and then we'll get back to doing the slides and having it recorded so people who aren't here can then take a look at it. Thank you so much for your introduction. I am a member of the sandwich generation. My parents both had a lot of needs at the end of their life. They did not live with me. They had very specifically planned for assisted living, had insurance policies that took care of that. They really taught me a lot about the legacy of love. And that's why I named my book the way I did, because they had planned so well, because they'd both taken care of their parents in one way or the other. And I learned so many lessons. And this is not an advertisement for, oh, you have to go live in assisted living. That's just what they chose. And I appreciated that they chose that, and I didn't have to make that choice for them. So those are some of the things that, I talk about in my book is planning ahead for the future. The other thing that I wanted to share with you is that I also, as a school psychologist, I worked for 20 years in education, and prior to that worked in a number of different mental health endeavors. But I spent 20 years in schools working with kids, and I can tell you that there is an impact on kids living in families where they're maybe helping to take care of a parent, or know that their parent is taking care of an aging loved one. It could be their own parent is not well and someone's taking care. There are a lot of kids out there under the age of 12 or even younger who are actually providing care at times. And we don't talk about that a lot. And I know that when I was a sandwich generation parent, I was hungry to find out what I needed because I didn't know what to do. And I kept finding information about what to do for my parents, but there wasn't a lot talking about how I felt being between two generations or what the impact was on my kids. But I knew working with children, how much what happens in the family impacts them, how it affects them positively and in other ways, right? So it's also a real gift to be able to have kids be able to be with their parents and grandparents and loved ones and learn compassion in real time. So that's why I try to have a very upbeat thought to this, but I also like to acknowledge the difficulties. So that's how we can kind of continue to build that legacy of love. So I wanted tonight to just spend a few moments with you, a little bit here between 4 and 5, and talk about 4 big ideas. And these 4 big ideas are parenting versus caregiving. What's the difference between those two things? Sometimes we think they're the same, and they're not. There are nuances that make them very different. I want to talk a little bit about future hopes and how that might help us to navigate this time period. inform our actions a little bit. And difficult discussions. Wow, we got to have a lot of those. And what are they? What are some of them? It's not a comprehensive list. Believe me, there's always going to be something new. And then strategies that might help. So let's kind of jump in. When we think about parenting versus caregiving, very often I've heard people talk about, well, I'm just parenting my parents now. And I think that kind of mentality sort of is miscommunication. It undervalues the kinds of differences that you're engaging in between parenting and caregiving. Certainly, there are a lot of similarities, and we'll talk about those. But really, we're not parenting our parents; we're caregiving, and we have to kind of look at how that's different than how we interact with our own children. And I'm going to say this now, and I'll probably say it several more times during the presentation, but our children are always watching us. They're learning from us as they watch us, and they listen to us and they hear us. They hear how we talk to our parents. And that's how we're teaching them about compassion, but it's also how we're teaching them about respect for other people, for loved ones, for elders, even maybe someone who's not always nice all the time because maybe someone's in pain, or there could be a number of different reasons. My dad was a wonderful, wonderful grandfather to my kids. And as he aged and had a lot of pain and he had vascular dementia, he could be a real curmudgeon. So they had to muster all that compassion to kind of keep smiling at different times when he was a little cranky. So let's take a look. I'm just going to look at this as sort of a Venn diagram. Parenting, what are some of the nuances there versus caregiving? And then in the middle is what I call the legacy of love. And this is the ways in which some skills, some things we need to bring to the forefront to serve both of our folks. So as we look at this, in parenting, we're supporting children to greater independence. That's kind of a no-brainer. You could figure that one out, right? But it's really important because this is much different than what's happening with our parents. Our parents, we're supporting them as they lose independence. How does that matter? It kind of matters in how we talk with them and some of the activities that we do. And if we just think that we're parenting our parents, it might lead us to talk to them in a way that's maybe not appropriate, or could be disrespectful or even hurtful. So we need to remember that they're losing independence, and that's a huge loss. And we might have to caution them at times when they're trying to do something that might be not helpful for themselves. Whereas with our kids, sometimes when they're trying out their independence and they fall, we might help them back up, obviously, and then we're encouraging them to take greater risks. I don't think we're encouraging our parents to take greater risks as they grow older. We might be asking them to be less risky at times. So it's a real difference. The next thing that happens is that's a little different is our children are gaining new skills. This is very similar. They're gaining new skills and we're helping them with those, while our parents are losing skills, and our intervention with them is aimed at comfort and safety, right? We're trying to make sure that matters don't get worse, right? One of the major dangers for older folks is falling. And, I just gave the analogy, oh, your kids fell down, you help them back up. We want to try to avoid falling when our parents are older, because breaking something when you're 85 is much different than when you're 5. So the body doesn't heal the same way, and it can oftentimes be the precursor to a real downward spiral. So we have to kind of think about how we're then shifting between our kids. And are we talking to our kids like they're 5, or are we talking to them like they're 85 and this is a loss? The other thing that's really interesting to me as I really looked at this is that with children, there are some predictable milestones and trajectories. Now, to be sure, children develop differently, but most typically developing children to some degree, have some predictable patterns and life milestones, right? We know as infants, they grow to toddlers, to school age, and so on and so forth. But that trajectory is going in one direction that we've walked. We've been in that path before, but most of us have not been 85 before. I don't know. There could be some of you with us that are 85, and if you are, I'm so happy you're here. But the point is, we've grown up and known. And I point that out because a lot of times sandwich generation parents have children who are somewhere between, say, middle school and college, right? That's kind of the age range where their own parents or loved ones are needing support. That's not 100% true, but that's something that's common. And so we've been 12 before, we've been 20 before, we've had our hearts broken, we've had friendship issues, we've had trouble figuring out what we wanted to do next. And so we can sort of identify with our kids as they're going through this. But we haven't been in the same situation as our parents because they're ahead of us. We're watching them, and it's a real different kind of thing. And then when we think about developing as an adult, the milestones become less predictable, right? Everyone ages a little bit differently, and aging and the way they're living is highly influenced by medical issues or events, right? So accidents. It could be that you have a parent who was a marathon runner in great shape and then was in a car accident or something. And that event then started a number of other events. It could be any kind of thing. It could be what particular medical issues might have developed. And for me, both my parents had some form of dementia. My mother had Alzheimer's. My father, as I said, had vascular dementia. Those are not things you can predict, exact, right? Those are things you might know you have some precursors to, but you don't know what you're expecting. Things come your way and you have to then respond to them. So it's a little bit less predictable. And so we're learning all the time about how to interact with our parent and what's going on with them. So where does this come together? What are the things that are the same? What are some ways of being that we need to be, masters of to really be able to toggle between both of these constituencies, both of these people that we love so much? And one of them is listening, right? So we're going to have to be really, really pay attention to how we listen to both our children and our loved ones. And let me just say too, I'm making the assumption that we all are caring for or might be caring for someone that's a loved one. And that's my nice way of saying it. It could be parents, could be grandparents, but there are a lot of people who are tasked with taking care of a parent they didn't have a good relationship with, are tasked with taking care of someone that they wouldn't want to spend all their time and resources on because it was a difficult relationship. That can be its own little wrinkle that can be very difficult in this time period. And that's another one where listening is going to be really important. We have to listen with a new ear. So we're not bringing a lot of old stuff to everything we're talking about. It's very difficult, but it's an important thing to think about. Our listening is going to be really important. And also our limit setting. We're going to have to set limits with kids sometimes, right? We wouldn't turn the house over to a 5-year-old and say, hey, we'll be back, take care. But we might not be doing that with someone who needs a lot of care from us also. Or we might need to have conversations with a aging person about the car keys, right? On the one hand, we might be turning, this is one I experienced, I'm turning car keys over to my teenager and I'm trying to convince a parent that they shouldn't be driving anymore. I mean, that's sort of the twilight zone that you're in at times as a sandwich generation parent. And those are two different kinds of limit setting, right? I'm going to talk to my teenage driver about certain things, where they can be, what are the rules of the road, and how long can they be out? And then I might be saying to a parent, my own parent, I don't know. I just don't feel you're a safe driver at this point. Let's take a look at what we should do, So limit setting is something we're going to have to pay attention to, and how do we walk into those conversations and how will they be different? In both with kids and with aging folks, we're going to be kind of vacillating between some teaching and some coaching. If there's a new thing an aging person needs to adapt to, we might need to do some coaching and teaching. A recent example I experienced is my mother-in-law is, for all intents and purposes, very healthy, but she has two really bad knees. At 85, that sometimes happens. And sometimes walking can be very painful for her. And we were with her on a vacation recently, and it was clear that walking was really difficult for her, but she didn't want to use a cane. She doesn't want to use a cane, doesn't want to use a wheelchair. Really understandable. We had to look at it from her point of view, but we also had to help her understand why sometimes it's going to be very necessary, because falling for her is a bigger risk when she's in pain than when she's not. So how can we help her understand that and coach her and teach her and help her know how to use different things that might help her? So those are some of the coaching, teaching things we have to do. And we're doing that all the time with our own kids. So, and in both respectful language. Again, our kids are always listening to us and they're always learning. So when we show up in respectful ways with our loved ones, they're hearing that. And that's hopefully something we want them to pick up as well. And then finally, compassion. That sort of colors everything we have, right? We're going to, and I like to think of compassion as empathy in action, right? We can all feel empathy for someone, but when we act on that empathy, that's compassion. And the other thing about sandwich generation parents is, and kids, is compassion. Consistent small acts of compassion are very good for us. As much as it might be taking a toll, it's also, when we really show up with compassion, our bodies release hormones like oxytocin, which is considered a feel-good hormone. It helps us. And those hormones are protective factors for our heart, which I feel is really, really a beautiful way of protecting our heart, which is feeling so much anyway. So that's something that's happening and doesn't get talked about as much. We talk about the tolls on sandwich generation, and to be sure, there's a large toll, but there's also these protective things that are there for us in the beauty of the human body. So as we move on, I wanted to talk a little bit about future hopes that you might have and how that can serve you. And before we talk about hope, so hope is such a lovely word, and it kind of fills our heart. As a strategy, hope is not a great strategy, right? Because it's just something we're thinking and feeling, and sometimes we need a strategy like, no, we have to do X, Y, and Z. But it's good to think about how do we keep ourselves hopeful in a time that feels really difficult. But I also wanted to spend just a second here and talk about expectation versus intention. And what I mean by that is, if we are thinking about this time period with our older person aging, and we know the end of the story, we know what's happening. Our loved one, our older person, is going to pass away, is going to die. We know that's coming. We don't know when. But if we are, nervous and upset and filled with anticipatory grief over that, it's going to impact us. But if we have expectations of how that's going to be, it's going to be really difficult, because expectations, any kind of expectation, is something that can set us up for upset. Because when we expect things, it's impacted by circumstance, right? So think about, I'm planning a family picnic and I expect to have a really good time. I expect everybody to show up, but no, then there's a rainstorm, and guess what? Somebody can't show up because their car was stuck in the mud and they couldn't get there, or this happened. Everything can come in and kind of confound that. And so then we get let down. So one of the things we can think about is, what can we control? We can't control circumstances that might interrupt our expectations, but we can control the intention in our own heart, the intentions that we use to come to the table or come to the event with happiness, joyfulness, patience. So it's our intention. So when we think about doing things in the future, it's thinking about what are our intentions for that. But what I'd like to do is just offer you an opportunity to do a very quick reflection. If you want to jot some things on a piece of paper, that's fine. But this is a very simple question, a very simple exercise, but it's a great example of how to prepare yourself for, I'll talk about difficult conversations. This is a great opportunity to think about preparing yourself for difficult conversations or difficult situations, and it's doing a reflection. And so I use the image of sunset because a sunset is a normal, natural event that occurs in the course of every day. And it's the ending of a day, but it's normal and natural, right? We know it's going to happen, and it's okay. It's the ending of something. But in life, death is also a part of life. It is normal and natural. Even if death isn't by natural means, like say by accident or some other unfortunate tragedy, we also know inevitably we all will pass away. We all will die. So we all face a sunset of some type. So when we think about how to approach this time period, it might be to reflect on this. And so here's a suggestion, right? So if you just sort of, center yourself for a second here, and I advise taking a couple deep breaths before you start out on a difficult conversation, but just imagine a perfect sunset with your whole family. Just a beautiful, perfect sunset. I chose the beach because I absolutely love the water, but it could be out in the meadow. It could be anywhere. But you imagine a perfect sunset. And as you're imagining that, what are the hopes you have for your children? Not what your children will do and grow up to do, not about their education or sports or future endeavors, but what do you hope for them in terms of their relationship to this time period, to what they're experiencing as being children in the sandwich generation? What are your hopes for them? And as you think about your hopes for them, what are the intentions you might have to help foster that hope, right? So if we want to, if we have an intention of our children knowing an older person and seeing compassion in real time and knowing that this is normal and natural and they adapt to that, what do we need to do to set that up for success? What can we do? And it might be a number of things. So that's a hope for your children. And then if you think about your parent or loved one during this time, what are your hopes for them? What are they going to experience? Do you want this to be a time of very little pain, very little, tragedy? What are your hopes? And then what are your intentions for yourself and for that in relationship to them? What can you do, and how can you show up to foster that hope for them? And then finally, hopes for yourself, right? What do you hope for yourself? That I can do this, that I have the courage to persevere, that I can fight through difficult feelings like anger, resentment, frustration, but also sadness or grief, or sometimes guilt, like, oh, I just wish it was over, and feeling really guilty about having that feeling. But those are all normal feelings. But what intentions do you have for yourself for this time? So that's just an exercise to think through how you can prepare yourself. Difficult discussions, right? I am going to talk about a few, and I'll bet you we could spend all night coming up with more of a list, but here are some thoughts. And what are difficult discussions, right? So the first thing is what makes a conversation difficult, right? What are the things that get in the way and make them feel like time bombs? And I took these next few slides in this piece out of some work I've done when I was working in school systems and dealing with difficult discussions we've had to have with families and parents. And so there's a great organization out there that does work, and they have a book called Crucial Conversations. And this is adapted from that. And so I want to be clear that this is stuff that people have looked at. This is stuff that's been studied. So I find this really helpful. And so one of the things that makes a conversation really difficult is that there are a lot of high stakes, right? There's something at stake. And that's one of those pieces of dynamite, right? And it I can't think of anything of higher stakes than life and death, right? So when we talk about life and death, that's a very high stake. And so that already sets us up for a difficult time. So then we add in high emotions, right? So we may have a lot of feelings around this, and every feeling, every emotion is valid. It could be grief, it could be anger, it could be resentment, it could be guilt, it could be anything. And feelings are valid. They don't make us bad people that we have a feeling that somebody else is going to say, oh, that's a negative feeling. You feel what you feel. Your actions and your behavior are what you can control, but your feelings, they come to you, they are information for you, and your emotions may be really high. So that's another stick of dynamite in our time bomb. And then finally, competing opinions or concerns, right? So if you're going to have life and death discussions, how many people are going to be involved in that? And are there going to be some people who feel very attached to one thing and others that are like, nope, nope, it really has to be this way? Or any number of things that can kind of come into the conversation. And so we have these different competing opinions and concerns. And, it's important to notice that these three things can really together be a very electrifying experience. So when we are aware of that, then we can walk in with a little bit more understanding of how we need to be. Again, we can never control the other people, but we can control how we show up. And so that's why I wanted to walk through the reflection, because I think before you start in on any really difficult discussion is to really be clear on your intention. And then when you do an exercise like that and just take some time and write some thoughts down and think about what shows up for you as you're reflecting, you can come into it with a little bit more peace and groundedness. But let's think about this. When you're having difficult discussions that might be coming up, and I recommend having these discussions. Listen, let me just say, if you're not already taking care of someone that's older and you see that on your horizon, start having these discussions now. Like I said, one of the things that the gift that my parents gave me is that they made these difficult decisions together as a married couple, and came to me and my brother and sister and said, here's kind of what we have planned. That was such a gift to me. I didn't have to think through or talk them into a lot of things. Now, in the end, I definitely had to have some of these conversations, like car key conversations, or, okay, that thing about you said when things were getting tough, you needed to maybe move into assisted living. I think that's the time. And those were the discussions I had to have. And it was, they were hard. They were hard. But prepare for a difficult conversation. I had to prepare for the discussion with my dad about the driving, right? I had to really think through how I would do that in a respectful manner, because I don't really have the right to take his car keys away from him. But I knew he wasn't a safe driver, so we had to have that conversation. So prepare, and that's why I did the reflection. Another one is really eliminate shoulds from your language. You got to steer clear of shoulding on yourself and other people. So if you show up to a conversation and you're just saying, well, you should do this and you should do this and this is how it should be, people are just automatically on the defensive. You want to listen more. So you go back to those listening skills and be curious, but not judgmental, right? So be curious when you're asking questions, not judgmental, and thinking about how you ask those. So then my next one is, I really recommend anything you might want to ask someone else, you ask yourself first. So ideally, maybe you jot down a list of questions you'd like to ask. But ask yourself those questions first. Put yourself through that process, and that might help you to think about how to ask it. Because sometimes we ask questions where it's real clear, we know we have an answer we want from them. And we want to make sure we're asking a really open-ended question and we're truly just trying to get information. And then making it safe for everyone. And some of the things that are important in making a conversation feel safe is that we allow time for silence, for processing time. We don't dismiss ideas outright. We let them be on the table and think about them. And then we're also willing to have more than one meeting if we need to, because these are not easy discussions. So you may need to revisit some things. So those are some tips on the process of walking into them. And when I thought about this presentation, these are the ones that I think, this is another aspect that I think is really important, is that is the plan of who and when, right? So who needs to be there? And I would suggest that less is more, but you want the right players there. If you have an adversarial relationship with siblings or family members that want to be at the table, or if it's already it's going to be very, very heated, you might want to think about bringing in a mediator. There's going to be a cost to that, but if the desire is to have a good plan, that might be a good course of action. But who needs to be there? And again, does everybody? Probably not. If you have a lot of siblings, it might be great to have a sibling meeting first and appoint one or two people who are going to be at the table. I mean, I've known families who there were maybe a sibling who was not trustworthy, was not healthy, and really couldn't be part of the conversation. So that had to be taken care of, right? So, and there's any number of ways to resolve that. But thinking about who needs to be there, and then thinking about when to hold a conversation. So I often say, this is not Thanksgiving dinner discussion, right? This is not what we do at Thanksgiving dinner. Probably wouldn't be what we do during all this holiday time. But I will say this about holiday times and gatherings like weddings and even funerals or family reunions. That's a great time to say, hey, mom and dad, I'm really missing these people that aren't here anymore. And it makes me think about, there's so many questions I want to ask you. So maybe sometime in the future, can we put this on the agenda? Can we put this on our calendar that we get together and talk about some things? It's a catalyst, right? So when you're having gatherings, if we're missing someone at the table, that might be a great opening to suggest, in the future, can we do this sometime soon? Can we talk about some things? And then when to hold, so that's when to hold the conversation, right? So we want to think about a time and a place that's not fraught with a lot of stuff, right? So find a good common time when people can get together. And then, are you ready for all the answers? So if you're walking into a conversation and you only want it to go a certain way, then you're not open to discussion, really. So then you have to ask yourself, is this a discussion or is this a confrontation? Is this an intervention, right? But are you ready for all answers? And be thinking about how you can maybe look at something you didn't think about before. Are you willing to see that and see how that might factor in? And finally, definitely be willing to revisit, because these are not things that will for sure get resolved in one conversation. And just I want to go a little quickly here so I can add some other things at the end here. The big four that you might want to have with aging loved ones would be end of life wishes. And this would be clarifying things like, resuscitation. Do they want to be resuscitated, or are they asking to do not resuscitate? And are there forms they need to complete to make sure that's documented somewhere? What kind of medical interventions do they want at the end of their life? Do they want feeding tubes, breathing tubes, life support? What kind of pain management? But also things like, what are their wishes for after death, burial, cremation services? What kind of ceremony, if any, do they want to have? And so asking those kinds of questions are really important. This may be a lot of conversations and not just one, so it's a pretty heavy one. And then for money and legal, I want to note right off the bat, I am not an attorney and I am not a financial professional. So I am not offering you any financial advice or any legal advice. So I definitely would say, in terms of money, it's always best to consult a financial professional. But in this money discussion, you might want to find out if they have a financial plan. Do they have any documents that need to be updated, like beneficiary designations? Are all of those things up to date? What kind of finances do they have for care? And how long do they think that will last? Is there some idea of that? Many caregivers are spending upwards of $1,000 a month to care for an aging parent. Do your parents or the loved ones you're taking care of have any money, and how to use that wisely? And again, legal, I'm not an attorney, but I think things to find out are, do your parents have an estate plan? Do they have a will? Having an estate plan, an estate plan or a will, that is a way to avoid probate, which can be very long and drawn out. Sometimes it's quicker than others, but you never know. So it can be really difficult. And money is the one thing that can really be difficult for family members to talk about, but it's important to talk about these things. And finally, in health, do they have a designated health advocate? Do they have someone who they're appointing to speak on their behalf when they no longer can? If you're on Medicare, you go through the company that is administering their Medicare, and usually companies will have, like Aetna or Blue Shield or Kaiser, whatever, they have on their websites health advocate paperwork that you can complete. If you can't find that, you can contact a local area on aging, state health department, and probably some great folks over at Del Oro can help you find where to find those too. So those are those conversations. And with kids, there may be some difficult conversations with kids, and here are sort of the big four there. One of them might be like, what's wrong with grandma or grandpa or Uncle Joe? And how do you explain that? And for younger kids, it's just being really clear. You don't need to go into details about prognosis or the disease process or anything like that, but it's helping kids to know that aging and end of life is all normal and natural. And it might be scary for them to hear that, but they also need to know it's normal and natural. And you can also talk a little bit about everything that lives has a beginning and an end. And, we may have had pets that died. We may have known friends and family who have lost a grandparent or something. So talking about this as again, always emphasizing normal and natural, that this is how things go. And then it's also important to talk about what's going on with you, because they're going to hear you and see you, and they need to know how you're feeling. You can't hide everything from your children, and probably it's not a great idea to hold everything from them. If you're grieving or scared, that's okay to share with them, and then talk about how you're dealing with it. That's a great opportunity for them to learn how to do some self-care. And they may want to know, what can I do? And that would be something that you can talk about, like how to interact with grandma or grandpa. I mean, this was something I had to do with my kids who were older, middle school and high school, but they got it right away when we started talking about Alzheimer's and dementia. And they were beautiful. They just could answer the same question 5 times in a row and smile every time as if it was the first time they got the question. And those are the things you have to help them understand. And that when someone forgets your name or forgets who you are, it doesn't mean they didn't love you. It's what's going on and how to do that. And finally, talking about death with children. Sometimes we want to avoid that, but the most important thing here is that you let children know what happened. We don't want to use language that's misconstrued, right? So saying something like, well, grandma went to sleep. Please don't use language like that, because it's really unclear. And especially young children they know you go to sleep. They're going to worry about you every time you go to bed. You need to be clear, even if it feels painful for you or for them, but using very specific language. I mean, I really think saying died and death, those are okay words because they're normal and natural. Many cultures and families use passed or passed away. And as long as children understand that that's a final situation, that's okay too. But it's just don't leave it up in the air and make it sort of unclear. Kids need to know what's going on. I'm going to pass through questions here and just talk real quickly about some strategies. Really important to build your team. Accepting help is its own kind of strength. We always want to do everything on our own, but the truth is we need help. So asking for help is really important. And that's a great role modeling for your kids too. And I like to say, think like a case manager. So a case manager sort of gets all the information from everybody else, doesn't do all the work, but gets all the information and makes sure the people who need the information get what they need, of course, with all the necessary written permissions and everything. But documents you might need to manage are things like a power of attorney, if it's come to that, advanced healthcare directive, current medication lists. Those are really important to have. And phone list for service providers and friends and relatives, because you never know who you need to call. And so having that up to date for yourself is really important. And so thinking about strategies, there are a number of tools you can use. Technology has really answered this call, and there are a lot of things out there. So you find one that fits for you. There are a number to take a look at. There are things like Caring Village or care.com. There's some that are coordinating help. So there's one called Lots of Helping Hands, and that helps people coordinate, food services or driving and this, that, and the other thing. There's a company, newer companies that I've heard of and interacted with are Iana Care, and that's a great organizational management tool. And then Kith and Kin, which is really new and robust and shows a lot. You can keep a lot of information there very securely. I know when I was going through this time and having to run to the ER a couple times, I brought my binder. I had the old school approach because there weren't these technologies. I mean, it was 2015. I'm sure they were there, but I didn't have time to figure them all out. But so I had my binder. I had an accordion envelope in the car with power of attorney and healthcare advocate paperwork and my dad's medication list and my mom's medication list. And I had that because people in the ER needed that. They needed a lot of information. So it's important to organize your stuff, and there are tools out there that can help you with it. Finally, just overarching, one of the things that I'm really passionate about is family wellness. We talk a lot about mental health these days because we need to, but and I said this on, I think, last week's program, it's time to kind of shift our conversation from talking about mental illness and talk more about mental wellness. And this can be a family thing. What are we doing as a family to set a tone for wellness? So I compare that to, say, dental health, right? So how many of us have taught our kids how to brush their teeth? And now that's just what all of us do. We all brush our teeth probably twice a day. And maybe we floss if we're really, really paying attention. We floss, right? And we don't even think about it. It's just something we do. But what do we do every day to take care of our mental health? We take care of our dental health, but how do we take care of our mental health? In terms of our physical health, we know we're supposed to eat well and we're supposed to walk and exercise. We may not be as good on that as we are with the dental health, but boy, those dentists, they really got us. They know how to help us. And we know that we brush our teeth so we don't get cavities. So what are we doing to keep ourselves healthy? And when we do this as a family, we're also then teaching our kids to learn good strategies. So it could be things like a family reflection time, or it could be some journaling or drawing pictures, or any number of things with kids. That's a place I love to talk about, is how can we help kids with wellness? And those are some great tools. So again, our children are always learning. What are we teaching them? How are we helping them? And how are we staying, as healthy and happy as we can be in this very difficult time? There are lots of joys in the sandwich generation, and there are difficult times, but we can kind of take a look at all of this. Hopefully it's given you a perspective to look at it a little differently. And that's really it. I had to rush through the ending there, but I wanted to make sure we got everything in. It's been my pleasure, and I am open to any kind of comment or question.
Before we begin Q&A, Christy, this is Simone here, and I just wanted to thank you again for giving your time tonight or this afternoon, early evening, sharing your wisdom with us and your insights. I always feel like I learn something new each time I hear you speak. So thank you, thank you, thank you.